Hi, I'm Tom Beebekauser with Wetland Restoration and Training. Have you ever tried to get anything to grow on compacted ground? It's almost impossible. Let's take a look at this site here. I'm going to try to dig a hole with a shovel. I can't even get that shovel in the ground, it's so compacted. Did you know that compacted soils are more likely to erode than loosened soils? The video today is called Rough and Loose. We're going to get rough and loose, and we're going to learn how to prepare sites for planting, and we're going to see how using the rough and loosen technique is going to reduce erosion in your area. The rough and loosen technique combined with pit and mound topography can be used to control erosion and to establish a diversity of native plants in the wetlands you're working to build. The original rough and loosen technique was developed by David Polster in British Columbia, Canada over 40 years ago. I've adapted the rough and loosen technique to improve the quality of wetland and stream restoration projects. Dave Polster says the rough and loosen technique addresses a whole bunch of factors to create habitat for a wide diversity of species. I restored a dam site, the Heber Dam by Campbell River. We didn't plant anything. We just made it rough and loose and scattered woody debris all around. In 5 years, there were over 80 different species found in the test spots that I did, including things like columbines. Dave says, "Do you know where to plant columbine?" His wife Genevieve pipes up, "Neither do we, but nature knows." Dave smiles in amazement at the number of columbines he saw that day. 9 different times. It's those sort of things that have wakened the passion in me. The rough and loosen technique is certainly not pretty to look at, and in many cases, after the initial restoration, the site looks barren with mounds of dirt and random debris scattered about. For the public, it can be disheartening to see, but with restoration, patience is the key. Visit any construction site and you'll see where heavy equipment operators have graded and compacted the surface of the ground. They've done this by traveling over the soil multiple times with heavy equipment. Unfortunately, compacting the soil sets the stage for erosion, and it sets the stage for poor conditions of plant survival and growth. The real erosion that you see taking place here, it's occurring after the first rain on compacted soil. This gully erosion, it occurred after only 2 rains on ground that was compacted using the tracks of a dozer. Contrary to public belief, compacted soil is much more likely to erode than loosened soil. The highly compacted soil on this road surface is eroding following the release of water from a truck uphill. The water flowing down the hill is eroding a gully in the compacted soil. Many people wrongly believe that compacted soil is less likely to erode than loosened soil. For years, I've allowed heavy equipment operators to grade and compact the soil within and surrounding each wetland project. What happened then is real erosion, and it's like what you see in this photo. This occurred after only 1 rain on a compacted surface. Look at how this silt fence failed to stop the erosion from leaving the site. The water was flowing over a compacted surface, it wasn't soaking into the ground, and we had massive erosion. Here's another problem with compacted soil. The only seed that sprouts and tries to grow is in the cleat marks left by the dozer. This is an oil well pad that was constructed over 30 years ago. The compacted ground is only growing a few scattered and stunted trees. Matters become worse when people use rubber-tired tractors and cultipackers to prepare ground for seeding. This action will compact the soil and greatly increases the potential for erosion. These plants are doing poorly because they're trying to grow on a site where it was prepared using a tractor and a cultipacker. It's of critical importance to apply a thick layer of straw to control erosion and try to get plants to survive and grow when the surfaces have been compacted. Spreading straw is expensive, time-consuming, and a really dirty job, and you don't have to do this when you're using the rough and loosen technique. Even a single pass with a machine or a rubber-tired tractor can cause erosion. Water is going to follow these deep tracks and cause a gully to form unless the soil is loosened. The rough and loosen technique provides an outstanding solution to the erosion problems that are caused by smoothing and compacting the soil. Here an excavator operator is using the rough and loosen technique to loosen compacted soil that is surrounding a wetland that we just restored. The rough and loosen technique fluffs the compacted soil. This is much like what you do when you prepare a vegetable garden for planting in the spring. Here are the steps involved in using the rough and loosen technique. The operator first digs down about 3 feet using the bucket of the excavator. The excavator bucket is curled to pick up the soil, and the soil is lifted vertically. Next, the operator rattles the bucket to break up the clumps of soil. The soil is now dropped on the ground, and this leaves an uneven surface of pits and mounds. We're watching Ted Crane, a highly experienced excavator operator, using the rough and loosen technique. What he's doing is that he's digging 3 feet into the ground, then he's lifting vertically, shaking the soil, and then releasing it in place. Just like washing the kitchen floor, you start at the far corner and you work your way backwards, and you don't travel over the ground again because you'll be compacting the soil. It is possible to use the rough and loosen technique and not mix soil horizons. This is done by lifting vertically and then releasing the soil from the bucket, and then you're not mixing topsoil in with the mineral soil. The operator moves from left to right while working their way backwards, and this way they don't have to travel over the ground again, because each time they travel over the ground, they'll end up compacting the soil. Here the excavator operator is moving its way left and right and loosening the soil as it works its way backwards, and it's not running over the loosened soil again with its tracks. All of the ground within the reach of the excavator is loosened. No strips of uncompacted soil are left between where the bucket digs into the ground. We want the soil to be rough and loose. If there are large clumps of compacted soil, they can be loosened by using the thumb attachment on the excavator. The rough and loosen technique is highly effective in establishing trees and shrubs in forested areas. Here, compacted soils on this site in northern Alberta are being treated using the rough and loosen technique. You'll be amazed at how rapidly the trees and the shrubs will naturally seed into a site where the soil has been loosened using this technique. Here the surface of the ground was left rough and loose, and notice that the pits and mounds are in a natural and a random fashion. We have high mounds, low mounds, we have ridges. There are no rows, there are no straight lines. I think you agree that this area does not look natural. The pits and mounds, they're uniform in height and spacing. Don't do this. What you see here gives the rough and loosen technique a bad name. The piles are too uniform in height and spacing. It looks like a PhD engineer did this job. Old roads in the forest, like the one you see here, they're eroding, they're compacted, they're not growing trees. This is an access road that was built over 30 years ago. The ground is so compacted that it's not growing trees over all this time. This route was used by heavy equipment to access a wetland restoration site. The soil is so compacted now that trees are not going to grow, and grasses will have trouble and will probably have erosion. So access roads are excellent places to use the rough and loosen technique. Here the excavator operator is using the rough and loosen technique to loosen compacted soil in a temporary access road. The rough and loosen technique provides conditions where water will soak into the ground and not run off, causing erosion. When there's precipitation and snowmelt, the water will collect in these small depressions and slowly percolate into the soil. Where soil textures are high in clay, some of the water will temporarily pool on the surface, and this will keep the soil saturated for quite some time and will provide great conditions for wetlands to develop. Look at how snow is collected in the dips created by using the rough and loosen technique. When this snow melts, the water will soak into the ground instead of running off and causing erosion. This upland area was treated using the rough and loosen technique only 2 years earlier. The cottonwood trees have seeded in naturally, and they're growing at a rapid rate. This oak tree was quick to take root and grow in the loosened soil. This site was treated only 2 years earlier using the rough and loosen technique. Look at how the sedges and the bulrushes and bidens are growing in the loosened soil around the depressions left by the excavator. A diversity of plants are growing on this site that was treated only 2 years ago. Sedges and rushes are growing near the depression, and cottonwoods are growing on the mounds. These plants colonized the site naturally. None were planted and none were seeded. We used the rough and loosen technique over 10 years ago to treat this field that had been dominated by Kentucky 31 fescue. We didn't plant any trees, we didn't do any seeding, but now look at all the willow and the sycamore that are growing on the loosened mounds. Let's visit some natural forested wetlands. You're going to see a landscape that's covered with pits and mounds. The pits are holding water and the mounds are growing shrubs and trees. Wherever you walk in a natural forested wetland, you're going to find root masses, and these have formed where trees have fallen over in the saturated soil. This root mass from a fallen tree is over 20 feet high. The trees falling over in forested wetlands create a surface covered with pits and mounds. Try walking in a natural forested wetland. It's almost impossible with the large number of logs on the ground and all the pits and all the mounds. It's easy to stumble in this diverse habitat. Natural forested and shrub wetlands are very messy. The depressions, the pits, the loose soil, and the trees keep most of the precipitation on site. The same pit and mound topography can be seen in natural, emergent, and ephemeral wetlands that are found within natural forested wetlands. The points, peninsulas, and the mounds found in natural, emergent wetlands, they support an incredible diversity of plants. Try to imagine restoring a wetland that will look and function like the one you see here. We're using the rough and loosen technique combined with pit and mound topography in many of the wetlands that we're building. The pits will capture and inject water into the ground. The wetland you're looking at here was only built 2 weeks prior to the photo being taken. This is a mosaic of ortho images showing an area of wetlands that we restored, and look at how textured the surface of the ground is. What we're looking at here is an area where we use the rough and loosen technique combined with pit and mound topography. There are many divots and many depressions that will capture water. Here's the same ortho image, but with 1 foot contours turned on. And look at how varied the topography is within and surrounding the wetlands that we've restored. Pits and mounds were added to this recently restored wetland. The wetland is only 1 day old in this photograph. The rough and loosen technique combined with pit and mound topography is the foundation for successful wetland restoration that will support a diversity of plants. This wetland is only 1 week old in this photograph. Here's a wetland that's only 2 days old. We placed large woody debris and snags in this wetland along with pit and mound topography. The surface of this 1 week old wetland was prepared using the rough and loosen technique combined with the placement of woody debris and pit and mound topography. Stream and river banks can be treated using the rough and loosen technique to control erosion and to increase plant and animal diversity. Rough and loosen technique is quite valuable with stream restoration. Here's a 1 week old wetland where we placed clumps of sedges and rushes to form hummocks in this restored wetland. While the bottom of this wetland may appear level, it's not. It contains numerous pits and mounds that create conditions for the growth of a diversity of plants and animals. It doesn't take long for hydric plants to grow in a wetland with pit and mound topography. This wetland is only 3 months old. Can you believe it? 1 year ago, before this wetland was built, the field was dominated by dense reed canary grass. Now look at it. It's a beautiful wetland. This wetland was built a year ago to treat stormwater runoff near the community of Duncan in British Columbia, Canada. This wetland's only 1 year old in the photo, and it was restored from an agricultural field which had been made by draining and filling a wetland area. Here's a bonus wetland. We developed this wet meadow on top of soil that was removed from restoring an ephemeral wetland using the rough and loosen technique. Here's one of the many wetlands that we restored in a valley following the removal of a dam. The dam had been built in 1918. This wetland is only 2 years old in the photo. The snags you see in this wetland, we place them to improve habitat for wildlife. Look at the diversity of plants that are growing in this restored wetland. It was restored using the rough and loosen technique with pit and mound topography. It's hard to believe that the wetland you see here was a managed hayfield only 3 years ago. Which wetland do you prefer? The upper one was built using the rough and loosen technique with pits and mounds. The lower wetland was smoothened and compacted. Unauthorized off-highway vehicle traffic can be a huge problem when trying to work to restore wetlands. People are able to drive their specialized vehicles most anywhere, especially through the bottoms of wetlands. One or more passes with a motor vehicle through a wetland can cause head cuts to form, and these head cuts can destroy wet meadow wetlands. A highly effective way of keeping off-highway vehicles on designated routes and out of wetlands is to apply the rough and loosen technique and also to spread large woody debris over the surface at the same time. Loads of large woody debris may be purchased and spread on areas where you plan to use the rough and loosen technique. We've changed how off-highway vehicles can access wetlands by using the rough and loosen technique, combined with pit and mound topography, combined with the placement of large woody debris. Everyone is happy when off-highway vehicles are passively encouraged to stay on trails near wetland areas. Many people are still building wetland basins like the one you see here. It's been graded and compacted. Hopefully it will hold water as planned. But if it does hold water, you can expect the wetland to become dominated by a dense growth of cattails. There are thousands of constructed impoundments across North America that are dominated by cattails. Why? Because the basins were smoothened and compacted, and cattails are about the only plant that can grow in these areas. The rough and loosen technique will change this. It provides a diversity of habitats and elevations where you get a diversity of plants growing in your wetland. This wetland is dominated by cattails because the basin was smoothened and compacted. This wetland's incredibly diverse because it was built using the rough and loosen technique combined with pit and mound topography. The Columbian ground squirrel is better able to burrow into loose soil, and it will find more plants to eat if it has loose soil where it can dig. Here's a burrow that was dug by a Columbian ground squirrel. It dug the burrow in a mound that we left using the rough and loosen technique. We built this wetland area, we spread the soil adjacent to it, and we loosened that soil, and Columbian ground squirrels moved in within a year. The loosened soil surrounding wetland areas is good news for the Columbian ground squirrel, and even better news for the American badger. The badger is a red-listed species in British Columbia, and it feeds on the Columbian ground squirrel. Loosened and saturated soils provide excellent habitat for the eastern box turtle, gives it a chance to cool down in the summer, and a great place to hide from predators. Toads are able to burrow into the loosened soil surrounding a wetland area, and this gives them a chance to escape predation. Areas where compacted soil has been loosened using the rough and loosen technique, these produce much higher populations of small mammals. We have found thousands of vole burrows in the mounds created using the rough and loosen technique. The abundance of small mammals found in areas treated with the rough and loosen technique, this means greater food availability for the northern harrier and other hawks and owls. Some people insist on using a dozer with a ripper attachment to loosen compacted soil. Now, I admire their effort because the ripper will loosen compacted soil, but there are some really good advantages to using an excavator to do the rough and loosen technique. First of all, when you use the excavator and the rough and loosen technique, you end up with this natural pattern of pits and mounds that inject water into the ground, provide different elevations for a diversity of plants to grow. Also, when you use the excavator, you don't have to mix your soil horizons. The dozer and the ripper will bury your topsoil deep in the ground. The excavator can be used to create a natural pattern on the landscape. It won't look like your field has been plowed with a tractor. So there are many advantages to using the excavator to do the rough and loosen technique. A disadvantage is that it does take longer than the dozer and the ripper, but if you have an excavator on site, you're saving money and you won't have to bring in that large dozer with a ripper to do the work. It is of great importance that you take the time to train the heavy equipment operator how to use the rough and loosen technique, because this practice goes against everything that they've learned. They've been taught to leave things smooth and compacted, and you're trying to teach them to leave things rough and loose. In the same way, it's just as important to teach the people on the ground supervising the project that it's okay to leave things rough and loose. We're used to looking at things that are nice and smooth. We want to change that with this practice. It's not necessary to install silt fence for erosion control when using the rough and loosen technique. Why? Because precipitation simply soaks into the ground instead of running off and going underneath the silt fence. There is no need to apply straw for mulch when using the rough and loosen technique. In fact, the rubber tires on the heavy straw blower and on the truck pulling the straw blower, they're going to compact the soil and leave deep ruts. And this will cause greater erosion and reduce plant survival and growth. You're going to find that there's no reason to use a hydromulcher after you've used the rough and loosen technique. The heavy weight of the hydromulcher, combined with the truck pulling it, this is going to cause deep ruts to form. It's going to result in much greater erosion and poor plant survival and growth. It's best to spread the seeds of native plants by hand after using the rough and loosen technique. I suggest using buckets to carry the seed that you're spreading over the loosened ground. The rough and loosen technique allows natural resource managers a low-cost and effective way to control erosion and to provide conditions for the germination and the growth of a diversity of native plants. The depressions created by using the rough and loosen technique will collect and hold rainfall. These shallow depressions will inject water into the ground and create conditions for wetlands to form. It's entirely possible to transform spoil piles into naturally appearing and functioning wetlands using the rough and loosen technique. I encourage you to move away from the practice of grading and compacting soil with heavy equipment and to embrace the rough and loosen technique. The gully we see here, this didn't have to happen. With the rough and loosen technique, the water will soak into the ground and will have better habitat for fish and wildlife. I'm Tom Biebighauser with Wetland Restoration and Training. I invite you to subscribe to our video series and to like it and to join us for future episodes. Thank you.